Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today, in our series about the great political fictions, I'm going to be talking about Salman Rushdie's masterful novel from 1981, Midnight's Children. It's a book about India. It's a book about everything. It's about food. It's about film. It's about sex. It's about love. It's about death. But it's also a deeply political book. It is perhaps the great 20th century novel about the life and death of democracy. The idea of the body politic is pretty much as old as the idea of politics. People have always tried to say that the way to think about, to understand what it means to live in a political community is to imagine it like a human body. Different parts that do different things have different functions, but somehow all the different bits cohere to produce a unity, a sort of organic unity, that means that the body politic is a whole, is a single thing. It's there in Plato, there's a version of it, though in that case it's the soul of the body and the soul of the city mimic each other. It's there in medieval thinking about politics, the king's body is the state is the king's body. I talked about a version of it at the very beginning of this series in Shakespeare's Coriolanus, the weird idea of the belly politic, that somehow the Senate in Rome is the belly of the state passing out food and nourishment to the people. The thing to say about body politic imagery is that it is almost always in the service of a monarchical or aristocratic or autocratic idea of politics. That's how it works, because it champions a kind of unity, a stability, a coherence, and also because it usually wants to say that there are certain bodies, the body of the king, the body of the ruler, the body of the people at the top, that can stand in for the state. There is an interchangeability between a particular body and the body politic. And for that reason, the idea of the democratic body politic is much harder to understand. It doesn't really make sense, and you don't hear about it nearly so much. There are at least two reasons why it doesn't really make sense. One is that democracies are meant to reconfigure themselves. They're meant to break apart in various ways and then come together. Different bits of the state are in charge at different times. And that becomes much harder to imagine as a version of the human body. It sounds almost like a diseased body, a malfunctioning body, falling apart, coming together again, different bits doing different things in different ways. It sounds too chaotic for the body politic. And then the other problem is whose body is going to stand in for the state? In a democracy, everybody is meant to count. But if everybody is also the body of the state, then you've just got a mess. It can't be both everybody and a single body. But if it's not everybody, who is it? If it's the president or the prime minister, then isn't the democracy collapsing back into something more autocratic, something more unified, but also much less democratic? That's the problem. And for that reason, you don't really hear about the democratic body politic in political philosophy or political theory. It does come up sometimes in works of art. You need a magical version of it. It needs to be a real feat of imagination. There is a great poem of the democratic body politic by Walt Whitman, the poet of America, 19th century America, his Songs of Myself, and its most famous lines, I quote, this is Whitman, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." That line, "I contain multitudes," is a way of saying that the poet, in this case Whitman, might stand in for the democratic body politic, but it's also going to be a contradiction. It is not going to cohere. The great novel of the democratic body politic is not American. It is Indian, Anglo-Indian, but it's a very Indian book. Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children is the novel of the democratic body politic. It's a work of magical realism. That's the term that's often used to describe it. There is something magical about it. To make the idea of the body politic work, you've got to go a long way, not just beyond the metaphorical, but beyond the literal. Very, very strange things happen in this book. It is the story of India, of democratic India, from its birth in 1947. And it tells that story through the life of one character in particular, but other characters too, who were born at the same time, literally at the same time. They are Midnight's children. They are the children who were born at or very near midnight on the 15th of August, 1947, which was the birth of modern India, modern democratic, independent India. And the central character, who is called Salim Sinai, is the child who was born closest to midnight, so whose life, minute by minute, maps onto the life of the Indian state, the new democratic Indian state. He coincides with India. Part of the magic here is the conceit of the book, is that the children who were born almost at exactly the same time as the nation have special powers. They have magical powers. All of them have particular gifts. They vary. Some of them are physical. Some of them are almost spiritual. In the case of Salim Sinai, his special gift is that he can enter into other people's thoughts. He can get inside other people's heads and he can hear what they're thinking. Particularly, he can hear the thoughts of the other Midnight's children. So he has a special bond, a mystical bond with the other children who were born at or near midnight on the 15th of August, 1947. He can think with them. But it's not straightforward, unsurprisingly. It's quite a weird gift. One of the things that he discovers is that he can't control their thoughts. So this isn't going to work in any kind of top-down or autocratic way. This gift, this superpower, is not going to give Salim the power to control other people, because when he enters into their heads, one of the things that he quite quickly realizes, and all of this happens to him as a child, is that they can tell that he's there. His presence inside their thoughts is registered by them as a kind of alien spirit at the back of their thinking. And when they feel he's there, they shut down. They block off their thoughts from him. So he can't really get in their heads in order to control what they're thinking, because their sense that he's trying to do that means that they rebel, they resist. The best that he can do, rather than getting in their heads, is invite them into his head. So he can also convene them inside his own thoughts. And at one point in the book, that's what he does. This child convenes a kind of parliament of India with the surviving Midnight's children. They're not all alive by this point. There's an attritional rate of infant mortality, but 500 or 600 of them are still there. And he turns them into a sort of parliament in his head. This is how the democratic body politic works. Salim is able to be India because he can convene a parliament inside his own head, all of these different voices. And these are children born in different parts of India, different languages that they speak, different religions. They have almost nothing in common with each other. This is India, the world's biggest democracy. It's chaos. If you try and convene a representative parliament, you're going to get multiple languages, multiple identities, and all of this is happening inside Salim's head, and it's a mess and it doesn't work, and he can't hold the parliament together. And the reason he can't hold it together is he can't rule it. He's not allowed to rule it. This is a democracy. He can't even make himself prime minister of this parliament. All he can do is try and keep them talking, and it doesn't work. It falls apart. It doesn't cohere. The body politic does not cohere inside Salim Sinai. He is India, but India doesn't know what it is in this period. It doesn't know itself. There are too many different voices. There are too many different languages. There are too many different identities for anyone plausibly to say there is a single body here. There isn't. Salim's life is the life of someone who never really knows who he is. He moves around. His identity is fractured in different ways. He is often profoundly confused about what it means to be him. And in that sense, he is India, and India is him. And that is the other great theme of this novel. It's a novel of partition or division. Salim is a divided self or a divided soul in all sorts of different ways that I'll talk about. And so is India. India is literally divided at the moment of its birth by the act of partition that turns ostensibly one people into two. India and Pakistan, the Muslim nation, and not exactly the Hindu nation, but the nation of Hindus. India and Pakistan are, at least on some accounts, what were one people, but two nations. Salim himself is divided in many, many different ways. And the book, even before Salim is born, is full of unforgettable images of partition and the human body. Because one of the problems with imagining partition through the idea or the language of the body politic is it's not going to work, because if you partition a human body, it dies. And in traditional images of the body politic, that was one of the motifs of political death. Partition means death. Partition means civil war and death. If you cut the state in half, the state will bleed to death. But Rushdie has all sorts of ways of thinking about how a human body might be divided up, might not be itself, might be many parts and not one thing, without death. Early on in the book, Salim, who's telling the story of his life, tells the story of his pre-life, of his origins, through the story of his grandfather, a man in this book called Adam Aziz, who has trained to be a doctor. He is a Muslim. He lives in Kashmir. He travels to Germany to learn the latest medicine, and then he comes back to set up as a doctor in Kashmir. And one of his patients is a devout young woman who seems to have all sorts of different things wrong with her. She keeps having a different ailment, and quite quickly we realize these ailments are probably fake. She's invented them because she wants to meet the young doctor, the handsome young doctor. Actually, not that handsome, but we'll come on to that. And so they come up with an arrangement with the aid of her father, who also one feels is quite keen to make this match happen, which is that every time Adam Aziz goes to visit his patient, two servants hold up a sheet in front of her because she can't be seen by the doctor. She can't allow him to see her body or to touch her body, certainly not naked. And yet she has these things wrong with her and she wants the doctor to examine her. So how can he examine her without seeing her? They hold up a sheet. He can't see behind the sheet. And then in the sheet, depending on what the ailment is, they cut a small hole so he can just see one little part of her body. So one week there's something wrong with her knee. So they cut a hole at the knee level and he's able to examine the knee, but none of the rest. Then it's an elbow or a shoulder or the back of her head, and it gets more and more intimate. And then maybe it's her belly or even her buttock. And eventually, ultimately, at the very end, it's her face. And bit by bit, he gets to construct an image of the whole body of a woman that he's falling in love with, but falling in love with piece by piece. He's only encountering her piece by piece. And he has to manufacture out of this a version of the whole, which is the person that he's going to marry. Eventually, the sheet will have to be removed. Eventually, he will have to see his wife's to-be body, but not until he has committed to her. And when he has committed to her, and eventually when he discovers the whole person, of course, what he discovers is that the whole person is not just all of the different parts together. Actually, he doesn't really know his wife at all. And it turns out not to be a particularly happy marriage. They are not well suited, these two people. There is a lot of misery in their relationship because that is not a stable foundation for a marriage, to piece the other human being together bit by bit from behind a sheet. This is the divided body that when it coheres into a single whole, and then you get the relationship of the two bodies coming together, is not what they were imagining it was at all. That theme runs through the book. It runs through Salim's life. So Salim is divided in all sorts of ways, including, most centrally, he is not who he thinks he is. He is literally not who he thinks he is, because at the moment of his birth in the hospital where he was born, and there's quite a lot of excitement about the Midnight's Children because a newspaper has offered a cash prize for the baby that's born closest to midnight, and Salim wins. But Salim is not Salim because someone else, for complicated reasons, too complicated to explain here, has swapped him with another baby. And so the child, the baby that is brought home from the hospital, is not the child of the mother who thinks she is his natural mother. Salim, the real Salim, that is the one who was born of his mother, is given to another mother and is actually raised in poverty in a different part of India and a very, very different life, and is called Shiva, not Salim. And the baby who was born to be Shiva, but who becomes Salim, is raised as the child of this family in much more affluent circumstances in what was then called Bombay, is called throughout the book Bombay. A completely different life by chance, by a switch, by a moment of fate. Because these two babies are born at the same time, at the birth of the nation, they each have magical powers. So it's the child of the poor mother who actually is the one who is the democratic body politic, who can convene India in his head, or at least try to. That's Salim. The baby who would have been Salim if he had been given to his real mother has a different power, which is physical strength. You're just going to have to bear with this. The superpower of Shiva is his knees. He has really strong legs. He is able to exert his will by physical force, by literally crushing people's heads together. That's his power. He's a completely different version of a powerful human being. He's raised in poverty. He has no advantages. All he has is brute strength and brute force. And he lives a version of India, a version of India's history as the embodiment, the manifestation of physical force, of coercion, ultimately of armed force. He becomes a soldier, but he's not who he thinks he is. Part of the endless complications in this book come from the fact that it looks like the baby that they think is their baby, Salim, belongs to the family because he has the distinguishing genetic characteristic of that family, which is an enormous nose. So a lot of people in this book have very striking physical characteristics. In Salim's case, it's his nose. His grandfather, Adam Aziz, who I said wasn't actually all that handsome, had an enormous nose. Salim has it too. So he's clearly the child of the family, except he's not. He's not who they think he is. He just happens to have a big nose. It's not his grandfather's nose, but they all assume it is his grandfather's nose. And it is a weird nose because he can't smell. So what should be his superpower, if Shiva's superpower is that his knees are powerful enough to break skulls, Salim's superpower should be that he can sniff anything out. That should be how he finds out what it is to live in this society, through smell, but he can't. His nose is one that doesn't take things in, but expels things out. So this is a book which is riddled with bodily imagery, including imagery of all the different things that come out of human bodies. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of liquid, human liquid in this book. So in Salim's case, his nose is constantly expelling a stream of snot. So there's snot in this book. There's a lot of sweat in this book. There is semen in this book. There is a lot of blood in this book. Bodies are constantly leaking in different ways, not falling apart, not being dismembered, but expelling all sorts of different things. In this case, it's snot. He can't smell. So the boy with the big nose, which sort of weirdly isn't actually his nose, if you know what I mean, can't smell with it. And he has to experience this hypersensory world. So India is described by Rushdie in this book as an extraordinarily rich sensory environment. The colors and the smells and the sounds and the taste and the touch. It's incredibly rich, and yet smell is not one of his options here. So it tends to be sound, the voices in his head, but also it's visual. He experiences the world by seeing it as a series of scenes, and it's very cinematic. So part of the magical realism here is that this is a kind of filmic version of India in which you get lots of scenes which are real in the sense that they look real, but all sorts of extraordinary things happen in them, as might happen in a movie. And a lot of the novel is set in Bombay, so this is Bollywood. This is the home of Indian cinema, and some of the characters work in Bollywood. And Bollywood provides one of the background motifs. So there's another version of the partition story of the sheet and the body that cannot be seen, and how do you create human relationships out of something that is so divided from itself, which is the Bollywood version. So as described in this book, this is a period where Indian films are very heavily censored, mainly to prevent them from having anything in them that could be remotely conceived as lewd, let alone sexual. So not even kissing, physical kissing, is allowed. Many of these films are romances. They have to be about two human beings, two bodies coming together to form one. These are romances, but they are romances in which the bodies aren't allowed to kiss each other. So what do? The imaginative directors decide that what they do is they will allow the characters to kiss an object, like a cup, say, and then the cup will be handed to their beloved, who will also kiss the cup, and a kiss will be placed on a kiss. So there's a mediating instrument here, which is the thing that can be kissed, because that's okay. You can kiss an object, and then another human being can kiss the same thing. And as Salim/Rushdie suggests, as with the case of the sheet, it's all deeply erotic. There is something heightenedly erotic about the forbidden kiss. One of the characters in the book, one of the many memorable characters in the book, is a man called Hanif Aziz. He is Salim's uncle, his mother's brother, and he works in Bollywood. He's a movie director, and he has a very successful life. He marries a Bollywood movie star. He lives a glamorous life, making these kinds of films, these sort of fake romances that are hugely popular, working within the constraints of the censorship regime. But he gets very frustrated by it because it's not real. I mean, it's so fake. It's so ersatz. It's nothing like, among other things, the real life of India and the Indian people. And he thinks they're being fed pap. And he's clearly inspired by Italian cinematic realism. This is the age of the great Italian films like The Bicycle Thieves, the cinema verite, to mix the languages up, that show a version of real life that are much more prosaic, much less magical. And Hanif decides he wants to make Indian realism cinema. So he conceives this great project, which is going to be a film about a pickle factory. And I'm going to come back to pickles. It's a big part of this book. He wants to film the pickle factory to show the real lives of the pickle workers. You know, what's it actually like to work in one of these factories? Not the romance of it. There are not going to be any romances in this film. It's not going to be love across the pickle factory construction line. This is going to be about the grind, the monotony, the physical discomfort, the heat, the misery. It's going to be real life. It's going to tell people who watch it what it's actually like to live in this society. It's going to have social and political and economic critique built into it. It's going to be incredibly boring, and it's never going to get made because no one wants to make, let alone watch that film. Who wants to watch the realistic film of the pickle factory? And he almost enters a kind of fantasy world in which he thinks this film is going to be made, and he writes scripts. And in the scripts, he insists they're going to have to use the right pickle because people would know if the pickle was wrong. You can't have fake pickle in a realistic pickle film. It never happens. There is no realism in that sense. The implication is there is more realism in the two people kissing the cup, magical realism. And Hanif gets more and more depressed. And in the end, he kills himself. It drives him to suicide. His life doesn't make any sense to him anymore. And he jumps off the roof of a building. And Rushdie describes his death, describes him falling from this building. And as he says, the blind beggars below look up and see this body falling, and they scatter. Another unforgettable image. How can the blind beggars see the body falling? Because they aren't really blind. They're pretending to be blind. It's part of their begging technique. But at the moment of crisis, the truth breaks through. In Hanif's life, the realism only cuts through right at the end. It's only at the moment of his death that he cuts through the magic. And even the blind beggars have to admit they can really see. The other great division in Salim's life is that he is a Muslim, and he is a Muslim from a Muslim family living in India post-partition. So his family don't move to Pakistan, though some of them do. But much of Salim's life is lived as a Muslim in a country which is not yet a Hindu nationalist country, but one in which Muslims are often discriminated against. And so he is in part both the representative of India and divided against the nation that he represents because he is not part of its majority. One of the challenges of the democratic body politic is the kid who's going to stand in for the state not going to have to be part of the dominant religion of the state. That's why it both works, but it only works as magic. And Salim's life is divided in the way that India and Pakistan are divided, and he moves between the two countries. So over the course of his life, and this is a life that runs up till 1981, which is the year of the publication of the book. So this is a life of 34 years. It's not a whole life by any means, but it is an incredibly full life because the life of India and indeed Pakistan were incredibly full. He moves at various points with his family or with members of his family to Pakistan. At one point, he is exiled by his family when they discover about the swapping of the babies in the hospital. Some of them turn on him. They don't want him anymore, although they eventually want him back. And they send him off to live with relatives in Pakistan. So he moves between the two countries. And in moving between the two countries, his body changes. So if Salim is the body politic, it is not the same body when it's in Pakistan. So in India, the big-nosed boy can't smell, but he can hear voices, and he can convene voices in his head, or at least he can try to, and he can see the magic around him. In Pakistan, he loses the ability to hear the voices, but he can smell. He acquires the ability to smell. And this is in part because Pakistan is a very different body politic from India. So he is in Pakistan at the moment when it's democracy collapses into military rule. And actually, his family, the relatives that he's staying with, are well connected with the generals who are going to end Pakistani democracy and impose a kind of military dictatorship. And he discovers in their world a much more conventional version of the body politic. Suddenly, these generals' bodies are the most important bodies in the state. They come for dinner, and you have to give them the right food because, my God, these are the most important people in the country. And as a child still, or adolescent, he's at the table when these generals plot their coup. And they plot their coup by moving pepper pots around on the kitchen table. Each pepper pot represents a different armed faction, and they start playing around with these people are going to go here and these people will take over this building and so on. And Salim witnesses it. He actually takes part in this. It's a completely different world. It's a more familiar world. It's not the magical world of the Indian democratic body politic. This is more like something from medieval or Roman politics. The generals round the table moving around the objects which represent the different parts of the state. And in this world, Salim can't hear their thoughts, but he can smell them out. He can smell what he thinks of as the stench of Pakistani politics, the corruption, the rottenness that's there. His nose becomes a kind of curse to him. In Pakistan, he's constantly assailed by these bad smells because no longer hearing the voices, no longer trying to convene something out of the chaos, what he sees is that the surface appearance of things is not the reality. And what he smells is what lies behind the surface of Pakistani politics, which is violence and a form of corruption. But he moves back and forth. And over the course of his life, there are a series of events, of wars and violent events, outbreaks of violence in the history of modern India, of democratic India, over the course of just a decade and a bit, which punctuate his life. These are the epochal events in Salim's life, his young life, and also punctuate the life of the nation. And each of them offers a different version, a different understanding, both of partition and of the Indian democratic body politic. 3 wars and a kind of coup. And these all really happened. One in 1962, one in 1965, one in 1971, and one in 1975. So every 4 or 5 years, something happens to India, and something happens to Salim. Something happens to his body and the body of his state. And in each case, there is an illusion of a kind of unity or reconfiguring of the state. The state is finding out who it is. It's finding its identity. And in each case, it's a kind of illusion. It's an illusion for the body politic. And Salim discovers in his own life that he's not discovering the truth about who he really is. He's just discovering how fractured his existence is. The first of these wars is the Sino-Indian War of 1962. It happened right at the end of 1962. It happened just after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is one reason why most of the rest of the world didn't notice that the world's 2 biggest countries, India and China, were at war with each other, but they were for a few weeks. And for people who lived in those countries, particularly in India, it was an absolutely epochal and terrifying event. It was a territorial dispute, as many of these wars turned out to be, in this case over disputed land on the India-China border near Nepal. There was a lot of skirmishing, and then actual fighting broke out. The 2 armies started shooting at each other. And this produced in India this outburst of almost euphoric national unity. And Salim describes it, Rushdie describes it, using newspaper headlines from the time. When India found itself under attack from China, suddenly a country that was now 15 years old and had had the same prime minister for all of those 15 years, Nehru, who was now an old man, who seemed tired, and the country seemed a bit tired and a bit lost. It didn't really know where it was going. Promised prosperity hadn't arrived. The nation felt a bit fractured. And then war breaks out. The nation's under attack. The Chinese are invading. And there's this outbreak of optimism, as Rushdie describes it, a sort of virus of optimism. India has discovered itself. India now knows who it is, what it is. We're a nation that must defend ourselves. We must repel the attackers. We're going to defeat them. We're going to reclaim this land. We're going to show who we really are. Our soldiers stand for us. We stand for our soldiers. We will support them. All of the classic tropes of national unity at times of crisis explode across India. Reverence for Nehru, the father of the nation, reverence for the soldiers, the sons of the nation. It's all going to be the moment when India finds out who it really is. And it all falls apart because the soldiers turn out to be poorly equipped and poorly trained, and they're no match for the Chinese. And all this happened. And the Chinese broke through the Indian lines and they started marching into Indian territory, and euphoria and optimism was replaced with panic and despair. The Chinese are invading and we can't resist them. We've discovered who we really are, and we are defenseless. We are weak. They are ruthless. And we are, maybe even because we're a democracy and they're not, we're chaotic. We haven't equipped our soldiers properly. Our politicians spend their time squabbling in parliament and bickering and talking. It's all hot air. Where's the substance to India? India turns out to be a hollow nation. From optimism and euphoria to panic and despair in a matter of a few weeks, the country has a kind of nervous breakdown. Salim experiences it. He experiences all of it. He never feels the optimism, but he experiences the sense that this nation that he can hear is falling apart. It doesn't last long because the Chinese invasion peters out for traditional reasons. The supply chains don't work. They go too far. And in the end, there is a kind of peace settlement. All of the drama fades away. But there is a sense that India has had a lesson about who it really is, which is it must not get fooled like that again. It mustn't believe the euphoria, but also it mustn't be such a weakling. It mustn't be such a child in international affairs and just believe that hot air and optimism is enough to defend you against an armed attack. India is going to have to become a more pragmatic, a more ruthless, and a more coercive nation. And that happens in 1965, the next of these wars. That is the war with Pakistan in 1965, which is another territorial conflict, now over in part Kashmir, where Adam Aziz and Salim's family come from. And in this war, India is tougher. India is better equipped. India is more ruthless, also fighting a less well-equipped enemy in Pakistan. And though the war isn't a victory as such for India, India feels that it has acquitted itself far better and far more ruthlessly in this war, which is violent. And this war sees a lot of destruction. India emerges from that war as a different kind of state, a more conventional state in some ways, but also a more ruthless and a more militarized state, closer to the kind of state that thinks of itself not as having in its army the sons of the nation who embody its spirit and its uniqueness and its unique personality and qualities, but having in its army a tough killing machine. And Salim's experience of this war as an Indian, but a Muslim Indian, and one who in this instance, in this part of his life, happens to be living in Pakistan, is this war is an act of colossal self-harm because the violence and the killing kills much of his family, his extended family. So he experiences that war as an Indian from the Pakistani side. And what he sees is not the Indian nation asserting itself, the Indian nation finally finding out who it is. What he sees is the Indian nation killing Indians, that is, killing members of his family, not just the Pakistani members, but some of the Indian members in exile too. What he sees is a ruthless killing machine that is increasingly indiscriminate. This is not an answer to the question of who India really is. This is a revelation of some of the things that India is capable of. And then the next war. The next war is in 1971, and this is the insurrection, the civil war, that leads to the creation of another new nation, Bangladesh. What had been East Pakistan becomes a separate nation by the end of 1971, after months and months of violence and extremely complicated, convoluted political maneuvering, but also terrorism, attacks on civilians, horror. And Salim sees some of this. He sees some of the violence, including some of the violence perpetrated by the Indian army. This is a Pakistani civil war in the sense this is the war that splits Pakistan, divides Pakistan into two nations, what become Pakistan and Bangladesh. But this is also a war with lots and lots of external parties involved. The Americans are involved. Henry Kissinger is involved. He's trying to play the Pakistani side. He's being as devious as hell. The Indians are involved because my enemy's enemy is my friend. So if someone is trying to take on Pakistan, that is the insurrectionists in East Pakistan, India is on their side. But it involves all sorts of devious and violent politics. Salim experiences it because he gets caught up in the war and he ends up in the jungle and he loses himself in the jungle. He has a terrible experience of actual conflict. He can't cope with it. He has a full-blown breakdown by experiencing war firsthand. The person who thrives in this war, the person, in a sense, as described in this book, whose war it really is Shiva, the other Salim, his alter ego, the one who would have been Salim if he'd been left with his mother, the kid who's brought up in poverty with no magical powers in his head, only magical powers in his body. And they're not really magical powers, they're just superpowers. He's just stronger than the other kids. He's more dangerous. He's more violent. He's more ruthless. Is this because of his upbringing? Is it because of his personality? Or is it because of his knees? It's never quite clear. But by this point, he is a figure in the Indian army. He is a ruthless soldier. And Salim discovers a trail of destruction that has been left by his alter ego, Shiva. And Salim and Shiva are always in this book two versions of India. They are the two sides, two of the many sides of Indian life, including Indian assertions of power. In the case of Salim, power never gets very far because he always gets tied up in knots. He is caught up in the divisions within himself. And when he winds up in the jungle, essentially his personality fractures. He can't hold together who he is now with his memories of his family, with his knowledge that his family is not really his family, with the idea that he is always many different things at once. If that's a projection of Indian power, in the end, it's completely impotent. Shiva is ruthlessness. Shiva is a willingness to use violence and subterfuge. Shiva is the assertion of the will. And in 1971, in the war that leads to the creation of Bangladesh, Salim fades from the story, not from the story of the book, because we hear Salim's side of it. But in a way, from the story of India, he gets lost in the jungle. Shiva is the one who marches through. And then, finally, the great crisis of Indian democracy that comes towards the end of the book and close to the up-to-date version of both Salim's and India's life story, the one that ends in 1981 when the book is published, which is what happened in 1975 when Indian democracy stopped. The Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, suspended elections and the rule of law in what became known as the emergency. She had been involved in a dispute with the courts over election results. The courts were making demands of her, which would include ultimately having to stand down. She refused to accept them. And so she suspended the rule of law, and she more or less established herself as an autocrat. It lasted for a couple of years, the emergency. And during this time, Indian democracy was dead. If this is the story of the Indian body politic, that body at least has died. And a new kind of body politic is emerging. Again, as with Salim's experiences when he goes to Pakistan, something more familiar from that earlier way of thinking about politics as being wrapped up in the body, in the life of the ruler. So India is now a dynasty. This is a dynastic form of rule because Indira Gandhi is the daughter of Nehru, and she is grooming her son, Sanjay Gandhi, to be her successor, and he is intimately involved in the emergency and in the suspension of Indian democracy. So it's a father-daughter-son arrangement. Father Nehru is dead, but his daughter and his grandson, Sanjay Gandhi, are now India. And Salman Rushdie described moments in the emergency where the chant goes up, Indira, India, India, Indira. Indira Gandhi, her name is the name of the country. There's just one letter different. She is collapsing herself into the nation. The nation is being collapsed into her and into her family, because in giving herself extraordinary powers, she gives her son, Sanjay, extraordinary powers. He's still a relatively young man, but he's a real operator, and he takes advantage of those powers. And one of the things that he does in the emergency is he launches a sterilization program. This is the time of panic about overpopulation. Something similar is happening in China too. The feeling is there are too many people in India, too many people to feed. And what's needed is a top-down autocratic approach to population control, a new kind of biopolitics, where the state will sterilize its citizens to stop them reproducing. And Sanjay Gandhi becomes the embodiment of this program. He is sterilizing the country. Its body has become an extension of his power. The other thing that happens in the fictional version, in Midnight's Children, is that during the emergency, the Midnight's children themselves, that is, the ones who have survived, all in their different ways with superpowers, all in their different ways outsiders, they represent Indian democracy because none of them are Gandhis. None of them are at the center of the state. In their different ways, they're all on the fringes, but they are now perceived to be a threat to the unity of India because they are the democratic body politic. They have to be rounded up and incarcerated, and they are. As part of the emergency, using Salim's special knowledge of them, they identify and round up the Midnight's children and they put them in jail. And that includes Salim as well. He is imprisoned during the emergency because the democratic body politic is a threat to the new body politic, which is the dynastic Indira Gandhi body politic. And one of the things that happens to Salim when he's in jail is that he is sterilized. Forcibly sterilized. He has already, he thinks, had a child, although even that is very complicated because, as is the way with this book, everything is not what it seems and everything is a double version of itself. The woman who is the mother of his child may also be the lover of Shiva, and so it's not completely clear whether his child is his child or Shiva's child. And one of the themes of the book is Salim not only never knows who he is, but he is a child with many fathers, including his biological father, who was not the father who raised him, who was not actually the man to whom he felt closest in his life. He is also a man who may or may not have children. He doesn't even know. He may have many children. Midnight's children maybe are in some sense his children because their voices are in his head and sometimes he's in their heads. His actual child, his literal child, either is or isn't his child. But he is sterilized because the death of the Indian democratic body politic requires the sterilization of the body that has embodied it. It cannot be allowed to reproduce. This version of biopolitics is the assertion of an old way of thinking about what it is to have unity and coherence in the state over, frankly, the chaos that is represented by Salim's life and Salim's existence. Salim is chaos. He embodies a kind of chaos and a kind of magic, and moments of extraordinary magical coherence that always fracture. And nothing about Salim's life is stable. Nothing about Salim's life really makes sense to Salim. And yet it's a real life and it is lived as a coherent entity. There is a story here. At no point is there any question that you don't know who Salim is any more than you don't know who or what India is. India is a real country and Salim is a real person. But it's very, very hard for either of them, seen from the inside, to understand how they cohere. What you get in the emergency is, depending on your perspective, either the genuine or the fake coherence of autocratic rule. The emergency for Salim marks the breakpoint in his life story. It's the breakpoint in his body, and it's the breakpoint in his existence. After that, nothing can possibly be the same again. Nor by implication can Indian democracy ever quite be the same again. It is restored. Indira Gandhi eventually comes back as prime minister. She is prime minister when Midnight's Children is published. 3 years after it was published, she was assassinated. Sanjay has died in an accident, so he is replaced by Rajiv Gandhi as the heir of the dynasty. Rajiv Gandhi becomes prime minister of India. He too is assassinated, and so the story, the cycle, goes on. None of that is known at the time that Midnight's Children was published. What Salim says of himself is that he knows that the breakpoint means that the next generation, his child, not child, is going to have a very different experience of India. And if his child, not child, in any sense stands in for India, it will be a very different kind of country. He says of his son that he knows that the second generation of Midnight's Children, if you can call them that, will grow up tougher than the first. They're not going to believe in magic and stories like Salim did. Salim tries to make sense of what it is to be him and what it is to be India by telling endless endless stories, 1,001 stories. The next generation will forge their future in the furnace of their wills. That's the quote. This will be a much more will-driven, grounded, pragmatic, ruthless country. And if Salim's child is going to stand in for that country, it will be as a more pragmatic, ruthless person. So 1981 is a long time ago. And in the life of India, it's not even halfway through the story, if the story is where we have reached now. That's 34 years in. Well, we're now more than 40 years on from 1981. But the book feels quite prophetic. India has changed. India's politics has changed. The Indian body politic has changed. India has just been through its enormous general election. The results have just been declared as I record this. It was the biggest election anywhere in the world this year. It was the biggest election anywhere in history. And the result was actually quite surprising. It wasn't the foregone conclusion that many anticipated. The Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, did not win the thumping majority, certainly his supporters had heralded, but he did still win. And he has just been sworn in for a third term as India's Prime Minister. This is still Modi's India. He has created a different kind of country, a tougher country, a more ruthless country. He is a more ruthless politician. This is a much more Hindu nationalist country. Muslims are excluded in all sorts of ways, which are not true in Salim's story. In Salim's story, he sees terrifying outbreaks of religious sectarian violence, but the kind of systematic exclusion of Muslims that happens now was not true in his version of the story. India was still a much more diverse nation in many ways when he was writing about it. That's why he doesn't know who he is, because he is the embodiment of that diversity. Modi's India is more nationalist. It's more ethnically unified, religiously unified. It is more prosperous, much, much more prosperous. It is more successful. It is asserting itself on the world stage. It is taking part in the tough, competitive world of international power politics. It is a rising power. It is a confident nation. It is optimistic. The optimism of 1962 was a mirage. The optimism of India today is not a mirage. It's real. It's not magical realism. It doesn't feel like magical realism, certainly if you were describing it as the body politic. And Modi is the embodiment of the nation. There is something closer to that earlier version. He's the father of the nation, and he is a supremely powerful politician. The dynastic politics described by Rushdie in Midnight's Children is not completely over, not by any means, certainly not after this most recent election. The latest member of that family, of the Gandhi family, to be a figurehead for Congress, Rahul Gandhi, did better than was expected. And he conducted quite an old-fashioned campaign. He walked around the country, he spoke for the poor, for the dispossessed, and he did, I think, chasten Modi to a certain extent. Certainly the story that goes back to Nehru and Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi, that story is not over. The dynasty continues, but it is not the dominant narrative in Indian politics anymore. And though Gandhi and Congress did somewhat better this time than many had anticipated, there is no evidence that they are returning to be the embodiment of the nation. This is not the first family of the nation anymore. If there is a father figure in India today, it is still, even after this most recent election, it is still Modi. Modi's India feels like a different country from the one described in Midnight's Children. Magical realism does not feel appropriate for this teched up, prosperous, aggressive, new nation, which is also more like other countries than Midnight's Children India was like other countries. The world described in Midnight's Children feels utterly its own world. India now is part of a global world. It is a globalized nation in a globalized world, but it's also a very familiar kind of powerful nation state. So maybe Midnight's Children and even 1981 or the period that follows it is the end of a story. And there are two stories here. There isn't a single body politic in India. This isn't the life of one thing. Salim's life is one version, and who knows how Salim's life would end. But in 1981, it doesn't feel like it's got much life left in it. He's going to die young. And maybe something else, maybe the second generation, maybe the child, no one knows whose child it is the rebirth of this nation, maybe. But there is another image. This is the one I want to end with because it's where the book ends, and it's an unforgettable image. So there's a lot in the book about pickle and pickle factories, and Salim, as narrating the book, is also describing his life living in a pickle factory. And he reflects on the thought that maybe the way to think about India is as a pickle, that is, as a condiment that is made up of all sorts of different things. I mean, endless different things, bits of bone and spice and fish and vegetable and vinegar, and something that is both one thing, there's the pickle jar, but always changing. It's never stable. I mean, the idea is it's meant to be stable. The point about a pickle is it's meant to keep for a long time, but it's constantly changing. The different flavors are interacting with each other, and any little thing that you add to the pickle, any little tweak to the recipe, even if it's tiny, creates something different. It's never the same thing. It's always a preserved thing, and it has a history, but it's never the same thing. And it's made up of endlessly different and intersecting parts that have an organic relationship with each other. If you add this spice, maybe it's not a new pickle, but it's different. And a phrase that Rushdie uses at the end of the book, which is my favorite phrase in the whole book, and I've never forgotten it, is that maybe what Salim has been doing in his story, in his life story, and in the description he gives of the life of his country is what Rushdie calls the chutnification of history as chutney, as something that has an almost indescribable variety of different parts that cohere into a whole, but it's not actually a stable whole. And you can never really say what it is. Its flavor is almost indescribable. Different chutneys, different pickles are different from each other. It's one thing and it's never one thing. It's stable and it's never stable. It has maybe an almost indefinite life, and it never remains the same. There is in Midnight's Children a unique image of what politics is. I've never seen it anywhere else. I've never seen it before. I've never seen it since. It is unforgettable. It's unique to this book, and maybe it's true. This isn't the body politic. This is the pickle politic. Do sign up now to PPF Plus if you would like to get bonus episodes and ad-free listening for this podcast. It costs just £5 a month or £50 for the year, and you will get 24 bonus episodes and ad-free listening on all episodes, including the entire archive. The next bonus episode, which will be coming very soon, will be my attempt to answer some of your many questions about the books and plays that I've been discussing in this series. There's one more great political fiction to talk about before we move on to our next series, which we had planned for the autumn, but for obvious reasons, I hope, we've brought it forward to now. I'm going to be talking to the historian Robert Saunders about the ideas behind UK general elections. We are going to be discussing 6 pivotal elections from the past 100 and a bit years, starting in 1906 and going all the way up to 2019. We're going to be trying to make sense of what those elections did to UK politics, but also of the ideas that lay behind those election contests. The last episode in this part of our series about the great political fictions is about one of the greatest political fictions of them all, Margaret Atwood's terrifying, unforgettable The Handmaid's Tale, a book that seems to get more and more relevant with each passing year. It is definitely relevant. The question is The Handmaid's Tale also prophetic? This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.